Hey, everybody, and welcome to Science Unsettled. This is Trisha Sheehan, holistic health coach. And I'm so excited about today's guest, Dr. James Lyons-Weiler, Dr. Jack, who is from the Institute of Pure and Applied Knowledge and What We Do Not Yet Know Studios, and an activist for the Unbreaking Science movement. And Dr. Jack, I know you're real busy. You're fighting the good fight out there and doing a lot of work. So we just really appreciate your time today, and we're really excited to have you.
Tricia, I'm really pleased to be here. Thanks for having me.
Great. Before we dive in, can you tell the audience a little bit about yourself?
Sure, I'm a lifelong biomedical research scientist with a background in evolutionary biology. There's not too many people on the planet like me. I look at everything through the lens of evolutionary biology, and I have a long-term mindset. I consider genetics and environmental factors not competing, but interacting, and I just have a wealth of I'm grateful for the wealth of education and practice research that I have. I was the director of the Bioinformatics Analysis Core at the University of Pittsburgh for a good number of years. We designed over 100 research studies and analyzed the data. I had a staff of 5 people at the maximum capacity working for me. Had a supercomputer. We had, high throughput sequencing data, genetics, genomics, proteomics, basic studies looking at animals and the effects of drugs on animals, and the effects of lung transplants on animals. We did clinical studies, biomarker development studies, and population level studies. It was I've had a career that's wealthy in experience, and I'm, like I said, extremely grateful for that.
Yeah, well, we're grateful that you're involved in the movement because you're much needed. So thanks for your work. So during the pandemic, the public has had a new or renewed for some and new interest for others in science as it relates to health topics, of course. And a lot of the listeners are not doctors or scientists or trained researchers, but we're concerned citizens. We're very concerned about what's going on, and we now understand that we can't just have blind trust, and that whoever they are, really don't have it under control, and that it's going to take all of us to work through the pandemic and beyond. And so the goal of these discussions is for people to become more empowered with information, become more informed. It's not just for them, obviously, to become a trained researcher like you are. That's us, especially a population. You have lots of resources for people who do want to dive into the nitty-gritty details of learning how to look at science and such. But there's this movement around, trust the science and follow the science.
Yeah.
And yet it doesn't seem clear that people necessarily know what that means. And maybe this is coming from a place of fear. So we have, trust the science, and we have unbreaking the science. Can you talk more about your thoughts about what you're seeing on that?
Well, I mean, I created the podcast Unbreaking Science for this very problem. And the idea of unbreaking science is that science itself is not really broken. When you have people who come into science and they do science in the name of, say, corporate profit, and the data are changed, or the study design is changed, or the data are misinterpreted, or the conclusions right in front of them and the data are there, but they write the paper where the paper says the opposite of what the data actually support, um, then it's not science that's broken, because those people are not scientists. Many, many years ago, a philosopher of science called Sir Karl Popper, he was knighted. This is how important his contribution has been. Taught the world that there was, in fact, a demarcation between science and what I now call science-like activities.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So you might put on a white lab coat. You might carry a pipette. You might work at a computer. You might have glasses. You might work at a university. You might actually use big 5-syllable words, and you might actually know all the trappings of science. But if you abuse science, the minute that you do something to the activity that you're representing of science, that puts it outside of the realm of science, you're no longer a scientist, you're a fraudster. And that is so much of what we've seen. Of course, the most famous example of this being the tobacco science. that was conducted on the question of whether exposure to tobacco products actually increased the risk of different kinds of cancer. They perfected, the scientists working on behalf of the tobacco industry, perfected the art of manipulating the studies to get the result that they wanted. And of course, that's not science. Why bother doing that? I mean, if you're going to just get what you want, just say that you did the science and say that if you're going to be a fraud, do it outright. It's much less expensive and takes less time. Since the tobacco industry lost that battle, corporations have learned that it's very important that they get a hold of regulatory agencies. And so they have infiltrated the CDC, they've infiltrated the EPA, they live and work with the NIAID. They have taken over the FDA in many ways, in particular with the way that the FDA is now funded. And so for the CDC to have a not-for-profit corporation that takes money directly from the pharmaceutical companies that make vaccines, and they're supposed to be in charge of determining whether vaccines are safe and overseeing that, they are charged by the US Senate to be the entity in the US government to make sure that the vaccines are safe. And they're taking money directly. There's no back alley. There's no hid. They're not hiding it. It's right there, the CDC Foundation. And I was stunned to find that the NIH has a foundation that takes money from corporations as well. This industry government partnership is a form of fascism. I call it American style fascism. So right from the very basic, you know, the way that science can be broken, it can be people that are in academia who are under pressure to publish, under pressure to get their grants funded, under pressure to be the, predominant person or voice in their field of inquiry. And they might, fudge their data a little, or they might, reproduce an image. That's a common problem in science, but they might conduct outright fraud, or they might just be sloppy. But it can go from that all the way to absolute, you know, total thought control over what people think is real. And that's what we're seeing. In my view, what we see uh, are people who have deigned themselves the arbiters of reality. And what I mean by that is there's two ways to approach logic and reason. One is to say that the human mind is so powerful and that we live at the center of the universe that what we say becomes reality. We can decree reality, and that's called a constructivist view from a philosopher's standpoint. And the other is to say, no, let the data speak for itself. We're going to take an empirical view. The empiricist view is scientific. The constructivist view is anti-science. So, when I see medicine, when I came from, empirical research in genetics and evolutionary biology and everything, and I came over to medicine, I saw a huge, huge, huge difference in terms of the abuse of authority. Argument from authority or to authority, appeal to authority is a logical fallacy, of course. Simply because someone's a doctor. Oh my gosh, if you're a doctor, people wake up and listen. I have a PhD, and oh my gosh, people wake up and listen because I have my PhD. I don't rely on authority, and I tend not to use it because I've considered using authority as an abuse of authority. It's also twisting logic. There are many times when people that have had many degrees have been dead wrong, and people have died as a result of their decisions.
Right.
In fact, medical errors, as I understood before 2020, medical errors were the third leading cause of death in the United States.
Right.
With the mistreatment of coronavirus patients, medical errors, I guess, arguably could be the first leading cause of death in the United States. So there is no truth in authority. It doesn't mean I'm anti-authority. If a policeman puts on the light, yeah, the truth is he's going to talk to me or she's going to talk to me, right? If they're pulling me over, there's aspects of how we should conduct and behave ourselves in the presence of authority. But there's no deference, automatic deference to a person who says something simply because they have a degree. Does that mean that everyday people can, you know more than their own medical doctor about certain topics? Yeah, I see it all the time.
Right.
Absolutely, I see it all the time. We know. I mean, Tony Bark, the late great Tony Bark, who we all knew and loved, exclaimed profusely and loudly that there was no training whatsoever on vaccines among pediatricians. There was a day, maybe half a day. Vaccines are safe and effective, and it's your job to get as many vaccines, and they save millions of lives, and it's your job to get as many vaccines into as many kids as possible, and that's going to be your life. And that's what I thought too, until 2015, when I decided to write a chapter on vaccines and take a good critical look at the vaccine safety science. And what I found in the vaccine safety science was appalling. I found confirmation bias. I found, design uh, flaws, underpowered studies. I saw particularly uh, problematic activity where people would design a study, they would look at the results, interpret the results, and say, that's not what I want. They would go back and redesign the study.
Right.
And that's called analysis to result. You're following your nose to get the result that you want. And I saw p hacking. P hacking is where you adjust your method or approach to analysis until you do get a significant p-value. You're saying, hey, there's a significant difference here, or you don't get a significant p-value. Hey, there's no significant difference, depending on what you want. um, yeah, so there's a huge problem. I think it's the number one problem in our society today. The dumbing down of America. Common core mathematics is no way to teach a person how to think logically and reasonably. It certainly is a way to get people to know that there's nothing out there that they can count on in terms of a reliable algorithm to find a solution, which is untrue. That's wrong. I have very, very deep concerns. A couple of years ago, even just 3 years ago, I had the luxury of one. My concerns over science was whether, quantum physics was a science. Were the predictions made testable? This was a luxury, I realize now. Now we have life and death situations. Hundreds of thousands of people have died due to coronavirus because a scientist with authority said the treatment science is not robust, and he's wrong. Dr. Fauci, I believe, is personally responsible for hundreds of thousands of deaths. Now, what do we do about that as a society?
Right.
And yet he continues to be cited. The media continues to go to him. I don't understand how in the world, if the efficacy of treatments like ivermectin and hydroxychloroquine are so well supported by the science, that anyone could take Dr. Anthony Fauci seriously another day in his life. I don't get it. I'm flummoxed. I don't get it.
Yeah. And there's such a divide, right, between people who maybe are just living in such fear that they can't deal with the potential reality that everything you're saying is true. And they just have to go with Dr. Fauci and what's on the news. And then there's this whole other group of people, which is growing pretty rapidly, actually. Sometimes I think those of us in this group get frustrated, but it's growing very rapidly to say, wait a minute, this is way too important for business as usual. This is way too important for just do what, someone at the top of the government says, and everyone's, becoming aware. So there's certain people who will never listen to the things that you're saying. But there's a group of people in the middle who are like, you know what, that is very logical. You have the background to know, if there's problems with the science. We're relying on the science, we're using scientism, that, science is the only reasonable explanation of what's going on in our world. There's no other way to know. And so, what do you think about that approach? And what can this group of people do who say, this makes sense, but I'm not, in the thick of it the way you are. What do I do?
Well, Tricia, you raised an important word. You raised the important word of scientism, right? Scientism is undue faith in science. Well, in reality, there's another layer there. It's undue faith in something represented as science that's not science, right? I'm an ardent defender of the public trust in science itself. Scientism is undue faith in knowledge claims that are allegedly from science, but if they come from voodoo activities by scientists who are just making stuff up and they're fraudulent, how can that be scientism, right? So we have to really stand by that demarcation of science versus non-science. And the distinction is really important in terms of people that may listen to me, or people who are like me, like other scientists. I'm not the only one who have decided to remain a scientist. When I became vaccine risk aware, when I became aware of the fatal flaws in the vaccine safety science, people used to ask me, when did you change? And I said, I never changed. If I found this about cardiovascular surgeries, I would have said the same thing. I just maintained as a scientist. I'd call it like it is. I see it like it is. I was trained to understand what sample size does to the power of a study to be able to detect an effect, and I stood by it. I was trained to know through a guy named Steve Jenkins at the University of Nevada, Reno, through design of a course on the design of experiments, what the difference between an experiment and an observational study was, and what you can say from observational studies and what you can't. I was trained on this, and so I didn't change. I'm simply maintaining, through time, the same exact perspective. And to the people that you think might not ever listen, well, they're in a lottery, really, if you think about it, because through certain events in their lives, they may be forced to become either vaccine risk aware or aware of the effects of psychotropic drugs. Their own child might be institutionalized, for instance, and upon being institutionalized, they might be given a drug, and then after taking that drug, they become seriously aggressive and violent for the first time in their lives. I wish this on no one, but there's a subpopulation out there of those people who poo-poo claims that the government is involved in shady business and shady dealings when it comes to vaccine safety science that may have a cold wake-up call. And it may be very painful to them. So I think it's in everyone's best interest to learn as much as they possibly can about how science should be conducted. And it's a matter of personal responsibility. I'm not asking anyone or expecting anyone to control what Dr. Fauci says, but you can control what information you have access to help yourself interpret what he says as real or misleading, or someone like Dr. Fauci. There's going to be other Faucis in the future. And so, what we have to do is learn as much as we possibly can about the central tenets of what logic and reason is and how science is supposed to go, how scientists should design studies, how they should not design studies, how to read and interpret a scientific study, and things like that. And that's why I created IPAC EDU. IPAC is the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge, where we actually do the research studies. And then IPAC EDU is an LLC, excuse me, that we teach courses to help the public become empowered. So in the public square, they're much better able to hold their own against people that are bamboozling them and misleading them with fancy words and authority, a mixture of fancy words and authority. It used to be years ago. Well, I don't want to offend my doctor. I don't want to ask any questions. It's your body, it's your life, right? His feelings about whether you think you might know something is more important than your own life. I mean, it's ludicrous, right? It's absolutely ludicrous. And it's not to take away any of the training that medical doctors go through. Most of my colleagues and friends are medical doctors by far. And in most of the science that I saw, by far, 99.99% of the studies that I was involved in at the University of Pittsburgh, I saw no problem with whatsoever. And in part and parcel, that's because I set up a process to make sure that if I was involved in something, there wasn't any of that. I was never shy about asking somebody, do you think this is ethical? I think it's incumbent upon scientists to have that frank conversation every time, every study, and they go to the IRB. But if you're trying to get away with something and you're a scientist, find another job. You can make more money doing something else. You don't have to, this is the problem. People get their whole identities tied up in who they are with their job. And I did. I certainly did. And that's a mistake. You are yourself regardless of what job you have. I was telling Gracie, my fiance, the other day, if I had to do any other career than what I'm doing right now, I'd be a bus driver, school bus driver. And every time the kids got on the bus, I'd say, okay, tell me what you go to school for. What do you want to be when you grow up? And then the next day I would say, oh, here comes the rocket scientist, whatever she said, or he said. And then the next day I would say, well, make sure you tell the teachers at school to teach you something so you could be a better scientist or musician or whatever it is they wanted. And imagine every day that they go to school, kids on a school bus get this message from their bus driver. One person like that can change thousands of people's lives permanently, because those kids would then go into school and they would say, hey, you know what, to the teacher, I would like to grow up and I would like to be a chemist. Teacher wouldn't have known that unless, oh, what can you teach me today that would help me be a better chemist? That raises the bar of teachers' expectations. So, there are ways that we can reform society that don't involve laws and protests. We just go talk to the school bus drivers and say, hey, why don't you guys do this? You
Yeah,
know?
yeah, I love that idea. You mentioned a little bit about vaccine risk awareness. Can you speak to everyone a little bit about your work with Dr. Thomas? The work you did was pretty groundbreaking and it's threatening some powerful economic paradigms, and it's brave work. Can you kind of speak to it, and what do you hope the public would know about that work that you two have done together?
Sure. So vaccine risk awareness itself is a phrase that I came up with or popularized. I may have heard it from one or two people, but I certainly glommed onto it pretty strongly. In saying, y- listen, if we're being called anti-vaxxers, let's do this identity politic thing and say, no, we prefer to be called not anti-vaxxers, but vaccine risk aware. We don't want to be called anti-vaxxers. That's offensive to us because we're aware of vaccine risk. And if you're not aware of vaccine risk and you're against us, then you're anti-vaccine risk awareness. And that wins the argument right there, right? And so there's power in words, but it's much more than semantics. Both of my children were vaccinated entirely. I supported their vaccinations. I was concerned, so we spaced them out of abundance of caution. This is just something that was very natural. No medical doctor, no pediatrician gave us any grief whatsoever about doing that. Right? Now, what did we think that we knew? What was our cause for suspicion? There was some concern over autism and Andrew Wakefield and that kind of thing. And it was kind of a threat in the distance at the time. Well, today, if you're over 35, you have received fewer vaccines in your lifetime than an infant has received by the time they're 6 months of age. We have no idea what the effect is on long-term health. We have no idea whatsoever. We have no reference population for that level of vaccination. And so Paul Thomas is a physician, classically trained. He's a pediatrician who absolutely loves treating patients. He loves seeing patients. And he happened to have a practice that had a variable vaccination uptake because he, under Oregon state law, was required to allow the parents fully, truly informed consent. And so he followed the law. He showed them the CDC schedule. And on the CDC schedule, he showed them some of the known risks, talked about the risks, and he also took a good look at aluminum himself. I mean, he was really super aware of the issues with aluminum in vaccines. And so he would then say, well, listen, we can use non-aluminum containing vaccines. That's not against CDC's recommendations. CDC doesn't specifically recommend aluminum containing vaccines. And he would say, are they making all their benchmarks? Have they lost eye contact? How are they socially? Do you think they're about on target with respect to their peers developmentally and so on? And he also would ask them if there's a family history of autoimmunity. And so in the patient doctor dyad, where such decisions belong, they don't belong in ACIP. They certainly don't belong with the body of legislators saying that, man, we're going to mandate this so you can't go to school. That's not medical. Dr. Paul was providing basically individualized approaches towards immunity. And in doing that, he was light years ahead. And he's a brilliant man, actually. And what we found was rather incredible. So from his data, 10 and a half years of his data, we had 561 patients that weren't vaccinated ever in their life. And then we had 2,400 or so patients that were variably vaccinated from low to high. And what we found was that the patients who had low amounts of vaccines versus the patients amount that had the more vaccines, they were all making the healthcare visits, the well child visits the same. So it's not as though the people that tended not to vaccinate were avoiding healthcare. And we address this in the paper. We show that as compared to fever, people that had fewer vaccines tended to have much more fever, right? Much more specific, not hospital, but pediatric clinic visits related to the fever from the vaccine relative to the unvaccinated. So this entire, the first result in that paper shows right there that this is not healthcare seeking behavior. And so because fever is causally linked to vaccinations, that's not controversial. So knowing that pattern and knowing that relationship, but then we looked at the other outcomes like ADHD and allergic rhinitis and sinusitis and anemia, and it's just healthcare outcome after outcome after outcome, and then autism and all the rest. And the first thing that popped out was I called Paul. I said, "This can't be right." What? I said, "Are you sure?" He said, "Well, sure about what?" I said, "There's no ADHD in the unvaccinated. We've got 561 kids over 10 years. Not a single one of them have been diagnosed with ADHD." He said, "Well, that must be true." And so then we looked at anemia. Um, Anemia is much, much more exaggerated in terms of the number of office visits that the patients have to go related to anemia. So this is the parent saw something. They said, "Wow, what is this?" The doctor goes, "It's anemia related." Boom. Okay. So that makes a lot of sense because aluminum actually probably responsible for anemia. Aluminum binds to transferrin. It's a protein that sequesters your dietary iron into your bones. And if aluminum is competing with the iron for transferrin, and the aluminum is being brought to the bones, which we know that's where the majority of the deposition occurs in an infant, and this infant is anemic, it can't get oxygen to the brain while it's developing. That's probably where we're getting neurodevelopmental disorders. Part of it. There's other causes like autoimmunity associate against brain proteins and the like. I cover all of that in my book, The Environmental and Genetic Causes of Autism. But we saw allergies, allergic rhinitis. We saw such a profound increase in so many chronic illnesses in terms of the office visits that the kids needed medical care for to attend to. That, yeah, well, the medical board actually in Oregon actually asked for these data, so we decided to put it through the rigors of peer review before we gave it to them, and we did that. And then 5 days later, they suspended Paul's license as a direct result. They held an emergency meeting as a result of this publication. They had had all the complaints all lined up and everything for months and months and years. Um, Maybe a year. I want to say years and years, but maybe for a year. And now, because we published this, there's an emergency meeting, and that told me that they're anti-science. They declared war on science. They declared war on good medicine, medical practice, and you know, devil may care about what the adverse effects are of vaccines on kids. Authority says that top down, they're recommended. All kids should get them, no matter what. Very few exceptions are acknowledged. And the medical board in Oregon overstepped their boundaries because Paul was, like I said, just providing informed consent under Oregon law. He was required to do so. So it becomes a political question. Uh, who actually rules the people in Oregon? Is it the medical board or the state legislature that says the pediatricians shall provide informed consent? That's a huge societal question. Do we have a ghost shadow government running the country in the form of medical boards and the medical industry? Or do they also have to answer to legislators? Apparently, the medical boards, they don't answer to anybody but other medical people. They allegedly answer to the governor in the state of Oregon, but the legislature put together the legislation. So at some point in time, there should be a reformation, I think, so that the medical board actually has to answer to the legislature. And this is a very, very important case. Paul's license is still suspended. There have been other actions that have been taken against him. I'm not free to discuss those. His reputation is being soiled. His practice is being destroyed. Uh, they're doing this war of attrition on him, where he might not get a full hearing for 2 years. Now, what kind of practice could possibly survive for 2 years? In the United States, we have this concept of the right to rapid justice, so that if there's a mistake in the allegations or they're incorrect, then the wheels of justice should turn rapidly so that the person can get back to their lives. They don't have
Right.
to suffer this undue, prolonged suffering of a hearing for 2 years. Are you kidding me? So they're doing everything in their power to make an example of Paul.
Right.
And if you've heard Paul Thomas speak about this, he's 100%, you know, in it to win it, whatever that means. Whether he gets his license back or not, he's already won. Because what the medical board has done is has raised the awareness of the vaccine friendly plan
Right.
far beyond any marketing scheme, far beyond anybody, right?
Right.
Or I could do on a podcast. Um, and that's part of what we have to do. We have to support Paul by promoting that book. He needs funding specifically for legal fight. He may end up needing millions of dollars actually to win this fight. So if you look up PT drpaulapproved.com, that's where you want to send people. Go to drpaulapproved.com and find out where you can support his legal fight. He also has a Patreon for his new podcast, which is patreon.com / I think it's Doctors and Scientists. But anyway, he's this couldn't happen to a nicer guy. And you know what? When this happened to Andrew Wakefield, and they went after him and they just soiled his reputation and so on, and those of his co-authors. It was the war of attrition. Andy could no longer afford the legal representation to fight, whereas his co-author did, and his co-author actually, um, his reputation was returned to him. It was restored. Um, but Dr. Wakefield, he had many parents that were supporting of him, but Dr. Wakefield did not have a Dr. James Lyons-Weiler bulldog fighting for him, right? So there are activists on the ground. There are senators in Oregon that are just pissed off at this medical board, and the medical board themselves, they're not untouchable. At least one of them has a very serious financial conflict of interest that we know about.
Mhm.
And so, they've declared war on science. They've declared war on good medicine. And Dr. Paul Thomas can't be called an anti-vaxxer because he vaccinated.
Right.
In the final analysis, we went to his finances and we looked to see over the course of his career, how much money was he sacrificing in terms of reimbursements for vaccines and revenue to the practice? And it turns out that he's been sacrificing one out of every four possible dollars of revenue to the tune of over $1 million a year.
Wow.
He's in it for health. He's not in it for finances.
Right.
So I'm encouraging everybody that hears this to find out what you can do and act on it today to support Paul Thomas. Get the word out. It's just he's an incredibly good man and he doesn't deserve this abuse.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I'll share all the links to his book, to his Patreon, and to his Against the Wind podcast series that he has going, which is excellent. And try to get the word out about him. And there's a lot of people who it's just hard for them to understand, though that's just a conspiracy theory. Like that sort of thing doesn't happen. Anybody who listens to Dr. Paul or hears his story knows that, this is the hard truth, that it's bad politics. It's war on medicine, and it's making an example of really good human beings. And it's not okay.
Yeah, totally. So those people, if they're going to, sling about the accusations of conspiracy theory, have a lot to explain. They have to explain why, in Paul's practice, for instance, when he would vaccinate kids and then they would start showing signs of autism or had a seizure or had autoimmunity, he would work with the patients for a plan to space them out or delay them or skip aluminum-containing vaccines. And then what happened was, if you look at the autism, right, you would think that, first of all, if our science was crap or if I was making it up for fraudulent, I would say, look, oh my gosh, the most vaccinated have the most autism, done deal, it's over. That's not what we found. What we found was relative to the unvaccinated, right, the number of office visits related to autism, it starts out small in the least vaccinated quartile. In the second quartile, it increases. But then in the third and the fourth, it goes practically to zero. That means that Paul's preventing autism. Now, neurodiversity aside, yes, every parent that I know that has a child with autism, and now I know thousands, love their children, Okay. It's not that they don't want the children to exist. It's not that they wish that the children were never born. And in many cases, they don't, you know, they don't even look at it as something that this is what God or fate has dealt their family. Okay, fine. We accept this child wholeheartedly, of course. My point is, how do you explain, if you think it's a conspiracy theory, that the least vaccinated have more autism than the most vaccinated, and the middle amount, the second tier, okay, they have even more autism, and then you stop vaccinating, and the kids, those who are most vaccinated, have lower amounts of autism? This is an incredible result that shows that Paul was probably preventing autism.
Mhm.
And that if you can prevent something from happening by taking away the causal factor, that's a big, big vote in the column of causality.
Right. It's a huge deal, and I have faith that 10 plus years from now we'll look back on all this and say this was the game changer, and Dr. Paul Thomas is now a hero. His reputation is more than restored, and people like you and all of the lawyers and different folks working on this and being brave and sticking their neck out are all going to be tremendous heroes. And we can't change that which we can't see. And so it's this difficult process of birthing awareness that we're involved in here. And um, I think it's hard. I have some friends with autistic children. I think it's very difficult for them to say, a decision I made that I made the best I could might have harmed my child. This might be my fault. And they say, no way. They can't deal with that possibility, which I completely understand. But now we have more of the data and the science that says, it's a hard truth and we have to look at it.
No parent that puts their child in harm's way and leads to manifestation of that risk as actual injury or harm will ever accept that it wasn't their responsibility. That's just the nature of the social contract between parents and children, really. But an analogy that I've told, when I give lectures on autism, I bring this subject comes up in question and answer. I say, if a policeman tells you that it's safe to cross the road, right? You got a traffic cop, right? And you're pushing your baby across the road and it wasn't safe, that was the policeman's responsibility, right? You should, of course, also look left and right, right? So it's every parent's responsibility to know the risk, but they're not alone in that liability. The problem was that the vaccines were causing so much harm that the pharmaceutical companies said, we're going to lose our shirt on the basis of these lawsuits for injuries. So if the vaccines were so dangerous that they were going to lose their shirts on the basis of lawsuits for injuries that they had to go to the government for indemnification, how in the world can the public take it seriously for one iota of a second, for just a tiny little second, when the government said vaccines are safe and are effective? It doesn't match up. There's no consilience of the evidence. It doesn't match. It's like fire and water. They cannot be combined. Okay. It doesn't work logically. And so again, that's why we're teaching these courses. We may never in a logic course ever bring up the phrase vaccine. When I taught biology 1 and biology 2 at IPAC EDU, I don't think I talked about vaccines once. It doesn't matter. The point is I'm teaching the public about genetics. Once they know genetics, they can apply it and transfer it to the setting of their most concerned. So yeah, we have a lot to do. And I balk a little bit at the hero thing because Dr. Paul's reputation is intact across the board in reality. In their constructed reality, which we're fighting against, it's tarnished. And so this is a battle royale for reality. It's their reality versus reality. I'm not even going to say our reality. It's their reality versus reality. And so I too am, Tricia, am optimistic that reality, they will come up against and have actually come up against reality. People don't know this, but in the 1950s and 60s, when the measles vaccines were being developed, there was a group of scientists, not unlike myself, that were saying if you don't update the measles vaccine every year, matching to the wild type, you're going to have a problem. And the projected year at which everyone who's immunized on whatever schedule they had would be able to develop full-blown wild type measles in spite of their vaccination status was 2022. Now we're masking. Measles is a respiratory virus. Okay? We had the Disneyland outbreak. 30 7% of those cases were said to be vaccine type. Right now, you're going to hear this phrase breakthrough infection. You hear it with COVID-19. You're going to hear it with measles. It's called vaccine failure. Is and the companies holding onto their contracts, they have the sense of entitlement and they have the power and the influence to get vaccine risk denialism encoded and codified into the practices and policies of the United States government. This is the level that we have to deal with. We have to actually have every person that's capable of rational thought realize that I'm not a crazy scientist, I'm not an anti-vaxxer, realize that Del Bigtree's out there saying stuff, Bobby Kennedy's out there saying stuff, and the more they attack people like us, right? Dr. Sherry Tenpenny, the list goes on and on. The more they go out and attack people like us, the more people wake up. Because why in the world, why hasn't anybody sued Bobby Kennedy for libel or fraud or something like that? Why, it's obvious because we're just telling the truth.
Right.
You can't sue somebody for libel or slander if they're just telling the truth.
Right. So it sounds like despite all of this, you're still optimistic about the future and the future of science, and that science can come back to ethics. Is that true?
Well,
Feeling optimistic?
there's a core backbone of science that is ethical. That hasn't gone away. What we have are these strange appendages that have grown out of science that are no longer science. They need to be chopped off. And that's why I came up with Plan B. Plan B is actually a plan to replace public health infrastructure from the top down in the United States. In my view, the most compelling thing that could convince the public that there was a problem with the CDC and how it was operated, and yes, the government got taken over by corporations, and they were actually harming people and creating chronic illness, would be to put up a wall that blocked off the entrance to the CDC with all the names of the families of people who were killed and injured by vaccines, and just abandon this site. Just let it go with the microscopes in place, get all the dangerous chemicals out, just abandon it and leave it as a legacy that this will never happen again. And Plan B is actually a plan that's published, it's peer reviewed. And it states that what we need is 80 research institutes that are independent, that cannot interact with corporations, right? They're funded by the US Senate. These 80 research institutes are located scattered basically randomly across the United States. Why 80, not 50? Well, if you do 50, then it becomes, it's a state thing. So we're the Alabama chapter, we're the this, and we don't. We want to depoliticize. First of all, we want to decentralize. So we have to decentralize it. And the number one job of these research entities, these organizations, is to independently of each other work to identify the number one cause, number two cause, number three cause of death and serious illness in the United States, just to focus on that list, say the top 20 causes. And then they inform through a complex process that I've created that mirrors a neural network. Actually, they inform the Senate about what the problems are, why people are getting sick, why people are dying, whatever those are. There's no profit motive involved. Any individual unit that is found to be in bed with pharma or taking money from pharma, or that their sister took their wife took money from pharma, they're just cut off. They're shut down. Everybody's fired. They're shuttered, just like the CDC. And then another one's set up somewhere else in the United States. There's a lot of scientists who are super, super highly trained across the United States that can put their heads together in groups of threes or fours, at five maybe, and say, okay, what are the problems? Why are people dying? What are making people sick? And with this bottom-up approach, this intelligentsia out there focusing on these problems, the only possible outcome is that the right programs would get funded to reduce human pain and suffering through knowledge. That's why I created IPAC. IPAC, the mission is to reduce human pain and suffering through knowledge. You can't solve a problem if you can't admit it. And so this is what public health should look like, hopefully in the near future.
Great. And for people who want to learn more about Plan B, where's the best place for them to go? Where can they find more on that?
Yeah, you'll find an article that links to the actual article at jameslyons-weiler.com. So it's
Okay.
published in a research journal. And you can look me up on Twitter at LifeBiomedGuru and find hashtag Plan B on Twitter. It should be out there.
Okay.
This is a political movement. We're gathering people together as a concerted effort to specifically overthrow the what I call the American style fascism that's taken control of the United States government. It's not going to involve rifles or bombs or threats or lawsuits. It's going to involve going and talking with your congressman, your senator, and saying that we know what they did. You must know what they did. And we know that you know what they did. And so let's just move on. We just need to move on from the CDC. We need to fund science a different way in the United States. And this is how I think we can do it.
Excellent. And I'll make sure to provide the links and resources for everyone that you mentioned today for yourself and for Dr. Thomas. And for the course you mentioned, can they just go to ipac.edu?
Actually, there's two websites I'll mention. The courses that I've mentioned, it's really incredible. We've just hired somebody to put together a course on the history of law in the West of the United States. And this is a foundational course where people can learn the history of law, where their rights came from. And then we're going to go on to teach constitutional law. And then we're also going to teach vaccine law and environmental law and so on. And that's just one track. Right, we have the biology track with a full course of biology. You know, we're not concerned about college degrees or anything like that. We're just giving you guys knowledge, information. There's Michael Gaeta is actually teaching the biology of nutrition from preconception to old age now. He just started. The registration is still open. But there's a great diversity of courses that are coming, and it's ipac-edu.org. ipac-edu.org.
Okay, great.
I teach a course. It's the most popular course so far called How to Read and Interpret a Scientific Study. And that one I'll be teaching again in the fall. I also teach courses on spreadsheets and biology. You can check out the website and see all what we're trying to accomplish there. One of the added benefits is every class is live in a Zoom call, so you get to create a community. You get to meet like-minded people who are interested in the same things that you're interested in, and we do have open discussions in the classroom. So we're not Zoom dictators with total control. So, but the other website I want to point people to is where the research is done. So we're working on phase 2 of the vax versus unvax study, looking at aluminum vaccines versus non-aluminum, and looking at other aspects like live versus non-live vaccines and their effect on health. That's at ipa-knowledge.org. ipa-knowledge.org. That's the Institute for Pure and Applied Knowledge research website. Okay. And the blog that people are hoping I'll say again is jameslyons-weiler.com. JamesLyonsWeiler.com. There's I think over 120 or 140 articles there, something like that. I've been doing it extensively for about 3 years, and I tend to put references and links, so it's really well visited. We've had over 1.2 million readers now at JamesLyonsWeiler.com. So yeah,
excellent,
taken off.
Excellent. Well, thank you for all of this. I know everyone listening has a lot to dive into, and I hope everyone feels more empowered with information and perspective from someone who's, working, in the science on the front lines. And there's a lot for us all to do as, concerned citizens, concerned health. A lot of health coaches watch these discussions, and we must all join the team. We must all be part of this movement, and we'll all create the better world that we want, that we'll get to. I have a lot of hope as well and a lot of optimism, but there's work to be done. So thank you so much for being here. Just really appreciate your time. You're clearly quite busy, and we will get all this information out, and we're with you.
Thanks so much, Tricia. The best way that people can help is a small monthly donation. That's how we do all of our science. So find the monthly Science Hero link at ipa-knowledge.org, and we'll put it to good use.
Perfect. Thank you.